Hello, everybody. I am giving you a lecture entitled Common Themes in Works by Southern Writers. We talk a great deal about Southern writing in universities below the Mason-Dixon line, but I think that people have a general sense of Southern writing by some of the plot elements or settings or even objects mentioned in a Southern work, like if there are guns, if there is an old truck up on blocks, if we are in a place where there are hurricanes and alligators, if we see cotton fields, we must be in a Southern book. And those are signs. But there is more than simply setting that makes a work either Southern or not. And I am asking the question with a kind of lighthearted, even sort of stupid way about it. What is a Southern writer anyway? And spoiler alert, I take this personally. I will tell you a weird story by the playwright Tennessee Williams, whom you will read later this semester, about what he thinks is a sign of becoming a Southern writer. He saw a little girl in an oversized chiffon dress she may have borrowed from an older sister, or maybe even her mother. And according to the little anecdote that Tennessee Williams uses in a foreword to, I think it was the play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, the little girl was playing with other children her age in this dress, and they were dressed in play clothes, but she was dressed something like the girl in this picture. And she kept saying, "Look at me, look at me." And finally she was screaming, "Look at me!" To the point where then she fell down on the sidewalk where the kids were playing hopscotch and started sobbing hysterically. Tennessee Williams wrote, "I believe she became a Southern writer." I think he was being slightly funny, but that's a weird criterion for being a Southern writer, and let's just assume that that's not a universal trope of Southern writing. Here is a colorized photograph of Mark Twain in his later years in his house in Connecticut. Some think a Southern writer is someone who's from the South, and surely that sounds like a logical thing. But if I'm from Mississippi and I write about Manhattan, am I a Southern writer? That's an interesting question. Or what if I moved to Connecticut like Mark Twain did? Am I still a Southern writer? I mean, you read Huckleberry Finn. He wrote that thing in New England. Does that change in any way his level of being a Southern? And then I asked the question, what if you live and write about the South in the South, but you're not from the South? This is a photo of me doing shots of bourbon on Faulkner's grave, a thing that many Southern writers today do as a tradition. It's a whole thing. It's almost, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a baptism, but it's a rite of initiation. It's like joining a weird fraternity. And even though I am from Brooklyn, I live down here and won a prize from the Southern Writers Southern Writing Conference for not just being a good writer, but being the most authentically Southern poet they read that year. My book was entitled The White Trash Pantheon. And just by looking at me in this coat, you understand I may have had some vague familiarity with white trashiness. And I speak now at the Tennessee Williams Festival as a Southern writer and at the Louisiana Book Festival as a Louisiana writer. But I'm from Brooklyn. So can a Yankee turn Southern writer? And how does race complicate being a Southern writer? We read Faulkner's Barn Burning for this week. And writes a story, The Man That Always Men. He's a writer of color from the Harlem Renaissance. But Does Jim Crow make it hard for people of color to be Southern writers? Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple. She is from the South. Is she a Southern writer even though she has chosen to live far away from the South? Or how about Latina poet Melinda Palacio, who's a New Orleans writer? Is she a Southern writer in the same way William Faulkner is, or is Alice Walker a Southern writer in the same way William Faulkner is? These are questions I don't propose fixed answers to, but I think they illuminate the question. More importantly, if I, your professor, take a weird, bug-eyed selfie while lying on the hood of a muscle car while wearing pearls, a Johnny Cash t-shirt, and an Ole Miss hoodie at dawn the morning after I give a reading of my poetry to a Christian college in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Tennessee right before I eat a biscuit for breakfast, is it actually possible for anyone to be more of a Southern writer than that in any possible way? For this, I do have a fixed answer. No, no one else could do it more Southernly. I won Southern writing forever that morning. Yeah, I kid you. JK. More seriously, it may not be entirely possible to define exactly who is or who isn't a Southern writer, but it is possible to identify common themes that recur in Southern writing. I've got a number of these slides and we'll go through these. The first theme that recurs in many authors who are Southern writers' work, we talk about Gothic tropes, and Gothic it has an element of horror and grief, and it's morbid and dramatic and stark, but it also has a kind of thrill to it. Southern writers are often romantics looking for the sublime in nature. That may not always be pretty. Remember, we talked about the sublime could be a storm on the horizon. Many times, this occurs in a place which Southern author Flannery O'Connor calls the grotesque. It's the absurdly over-the-top details of something, the distortions of things that might make something Gothic. When we talk about American Horror Story, for instance, that show, that is a Gothic show through and through, and in many cases a Southern Gothic show. But Gothic includes also just the melodrama of grief, and Southern writers are often haunted by the past. We'll talk about the past in a little bit, and hence Gothic horror was perfected by Edgar Allan Poe. I'm guessing that in high school you read a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe, and he is very much a Southern writer and a Gothic writer. Shadow powers are a theme not just of Southern writers, but certainly Southern writers. And in Southern politics, for the history of Southern politics, there are often two competing powers: the law that is on the books and the social connections of those both applying and receiving legal penalties or benefits. And many Southern authors write about this. Come to mind immediately, if you recall, the court scene from To Kill a Mockingbird. Allen Gurganus ends The Oldest Confederate Widow Tells All with a court scene that's about these double politics. It is something that occurs in Southern writing. There is something, it would be good for you to know the name of this, the Lost Cause mythos. And I want to say many, if not all, Southern writers today utterly reject this, but it has been a tradition with Southern writers. I think of William Faulkner and Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind. What happens is an idealization of plantation culture, as if nobody ever had a bad day on a plantation before the Yankees invaded. Think of Gone with the Wind if you've ever seen the movie with your grandma or read the book. I think it's actually a very well written book, although it is kind of racist in some places. Faulkner talks about the aftermath, of course, of the Civil War, which was devastating economically for many communities. However, uh, remember we talked about propaganda related to the plantation culture. And here's what I said. The Lost Cause mythos holds that things were happy. Think of the song Dixie that we talked about earlier in the class in the South until the Yankees invaded. And after that, it was a hard place for the noble men and women. There was no bad Confederate of the Confederacy and their descendants to live. The only thing that could make you a bad Confederate is if you conspired with Yankee carpetbaggers like me. Writers today often reject this false story as it makes slavery sound like a great institution perverted by those who wish to liberate slaves. Yeah, I'm glad that contemporary writers are not on board with this because that's as bad a lie as you can have. There is also the problem of the inescapable past in almost every Southern work. The past is a present tense thing in a way that it's not in the North. Many things happened, for instance, in New York City. We're used to upheaval and innovation, and we don't look back a whole lot. We just keep moving forward in New York City. The South remembers. You may recall in Game of Thrones, there was a refrain of the people who talked to the Stark family, the North remembers. Well, the South here in the United States in real life remembers. There is the inescapable past. William Faulkner said famously, the past is never dead. It's not even the past. And many Southern writers talk about the past as an intimate legacy that informs the present continually and significantly. That means the history of a town is going to make you be who you are to some degree in a Southern novel. But it also means once you got the reputation of slut in a small town, you could be 75 years old, you've still not lived that down. The past is inescapable in many works of Southern writing. The problem of gender expectations that are often possible to meet are an important part of Southern writing. Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and I really, I'm not going to tell you it's not a novel without a ton of problems. But Margaret Mitchell, racist that she was, could write a paragraph. Let me tell you, she could. Which is not to say that we should forgive her, but only that it's worth reading her. One thing I would do in another class setting, maybe for an advanced class, would be to teach her novel Gone with the Wind with the African American response writing back to that book by Alice Randall called The Wind Done Gone, which is the perfect pairing of the conversation about what the Civil War meant. It's really well written, The Wind Done Gone by Alice Randall, if you get a chance, another Southern writer. Scarlett O'Hara spends most of Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, define what ladies are allowed to do in the hoop-skirted South. It's all about how, what does Scarlett do? Well, she manages to get through the Yankee lines to get home. She shoots a Yankee soldier who invades her house and seems to have more than just robbery on his mind. She starts her own business, lies about the competition. She makes tough decisions. She breaks all the rules for Southern belles that are supposed to be martyred and passive. We see in the entirety of Tennessee Williams' plays the defiance of gender roles. Streetcar Named Desire is not his most gender bending play, but I think about The Glass Menagerie, if you've read that. His mother, Tom's mother in the the play, Amanda Winfield, is freaking out because her son keeps going out at night and she doesn't know where he's going, and he says he's going to the movies by himself, and she thinks that's vague. But this is a coded conversation about Tennessee Williams going to sit in a dark theater so he can have sexual encounters with men. At least that's one way to read the play. Tennessee Williams, in case you didn't know this, was gay. And his works have that undercurrent to them. Southern writers also have complicated relationships with church and religion. I'm not saying they don't believe in Jesus. Y'all believe in Jesus down here, and so do I. I joke with my friends, I had to move south because I love fried food, Elvis, and Jesus far too much to stay in Brooklyn. And you just read an example of that complicated relationship with organized religion. All right, then, I'll go to hell, is what Huckleberry Finn says, and that is the pivotal moment in possibly all of Southern writing. A feeling of confinement, not so much of space as in possibilities. If you're going to stay in town, you're always going to be defined by that pernicious past. Maybe there's no opportunities in this town for anybody, but especially not someone from your people, whatever that might mean. Southern characters, particularly I think of Carson McCullers' work, are trapped not so much in actual confinement, though slaves were literally in shackles here, but in circumstances that small town life will never permit to change. If you're going to stay in the small town, you're going to have small possibilities. And people suffer in Southern writing because here are some more. There is the trauma of brutality. Southern books are often filled with sudden acts of great brutality. Resentment seems to simmer a long time, but violence in books by Southern writers often seems explosive. I believe that Flannery O'Connor's short stories are as violent as they are as with what she called the grotesque, or I would include that in the Gothic. But there's also a great deal of talking about trauma in these books, either the causing of it or the reaction to it. Great violence done 5 minutes after people smiled at each other. Every Southern book I have ever read contains half-uttered secrets that the reader must dig for between the lines. People don't tell their business to just anybody in a small town because it stays with you forever. This is reflected in the way that people talk about things. Even more ridiculously socially, people will act outrageously when they're not just drunk but crunk in the South, and then they'll say the next morning, "I just don't remember what all happened last night." It seems to be something that happens in the South, that people bury secrets, although in Southern books they tend to be unsuccessful at that. And sex that breaks the rules, which may follow my comment about the bourbon. This happens quite explicitly in books like Rosemary Daniels' Sleeping with Soldiers. Don't tell your mama I told you about that book. Or more subtly, like in Streetcar Named Desire. We'll talk about that. But Southern characters in works of literature seem to sit on Saturday night and pretend it never happened on Sunday morning. Again, I don't know what all happened. Themes that recur in Southern writers' work would also include truth-given symbolic life in nature. Remember, the Mississippi equals freedom to some degree in Huckleberry Finn, and the nature speaks where people hold secrets. I think of the passage in Genesis, which I believe more than one Southern writer has talked about, when Cain murders his brother Abel. God says to Cain, "Your brother's blood speaks to me from the ground." A lot of Southern writers have done something with blood speaking from the ground. I think of Tom Franklin's book, Crooked Letter, as an example of an evocative nature. And if you haven't read that, it's a wonderful novel, really well written. It's a bit genre-ish. It's murder mystery, but it's high art. And the nature of the town in Mississippi where the events take place is really a character unto itself. And then we have the problem of racism. I mean, given the heritage of oppression in the South, the fact that there were slaves here, the fact that Jim Crow is not a faint memory, the past isn't even the past here, says Faulkner. How could there be anything written that was authentically Southern without a discussion of race at some level? I recommend a book that came out this year by Southern author Maurice Ruffin, a Black Southern author talking about race in a dystopian New Orleans called We Cast a Shadow. That book rocks my face off. It's an amazing book. And it's about race, and it's not about the lost cause exactly. In fact, perhaps the book asks how lost the cause actually was. Do Black people still effectively live as if they were in a plantation culture today, even in a contemporary New Orleans? And the problem of class division is poignant in stories like barn burning. There's a lot wrong with the Snopes family in barn burning, but one thing that isn't their fault is that they are dirt poor and treated like second-class citizens in a number of ways. Now, the father may have brought a good deal of that on himself and commits crimes, but being poor in the South is a trauma. And if you are poor in a Southern work of fiction, you are stuck in a bad place forever. And notwithstanding all the trauma and murder I've just talked about, there's a lot of humor in Southern writing. Again, I want to emphasize, not all Southerners are funny, but funny Southerners are absolutely the funniest people who write in American literature, at least according to me, and you can take that with a grain of salt. But I see just funny and funny in that order in some books. And this lady is one of the funniest people I've ever read. Her name is Julia Reed, and she writes about the sort of extraordinary Baroque things that people do in the South that they don't do in other places. And she says that Southern writing is the odd placement of formality next to trashy. Now, I'm not calling Ms. Reed trashy. Look at her lovely house. I think she's very modest. I've met her. She's a traditional Southern lady from Mississippi. But she says in the South, it's the juxtapositions that get you. Like if the lady in this picture were wearing leopard print hot pants, that's not Ms. Reed, but it would be a possibility if you were ever walking around the French Quarter to see a lady who looks like this, whose bottom half doesn't match her top half. And what makes Southern writing Southern, it seems to lie to some degree in the surprising combination of things that seem to contradict themselves. It's the paradoxes here. And Southern writing is often paradoxical, I would say especially when it is good. I leave you to your own reflections on Southern writing, but I thought I would be malpracticing you if I didn't bring it up, given our reading list. I have given you ideas to wrestle with rather than firm answers because I believe the tradition is morphing and ongoing of Southern writing, and I am delighted to be one of the people practicing writing in the South.